When Emily discovers that her ruthless boss, Mr. Richards, is secretly stealing millions from trusting clients, including a vulnerable widow, she devises a daring plan to expose him. Teaming up with Richards' overworked assistant, Stacy, Emily uncovers damning evidence and orchestrates a scheme to bring him down. But just as victory seems within reach, Richards flips the script, framing Emily and Stacy as the masterminds of his crimes. With their lives in shambles and the world against them, the two must navigate a tangled web of lies, sabotage, and betrayal. As the stakes rise, Emily realizes that playing fair won't cut it anymore. If she wants justice, and revenge, she'll have to outsmart the man who thought he was untouchable. This is a gripping tale of betrayal, scandal, and a battle for redemption, where the lines between right and wrong blur, and the ultimate payback comes at a shocking cost. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above my desk, their cold glow a harsh reminder of how late it was. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, but there I was, hunched over my computer, eyes scanning endless spreadsheets. It wasn't unusual. Late nights were part of the deal when you worked for someone like Mr. Richards. He owned the firm and treated it like his personal fiefdom. Every employee, every client, every dollar, it all belonged to him, or so he thought. To Richards, people like me were disposable tools. You either produced results or you were gone. And I wasn't just producing, I was keeping the place afloat. 5 years of loyalty, and what did I have to show for it? Crippling stress, a laughable salary, and a savings account that barely kept me above water. That night, though, something changed. Emily, Mrs. Whitmore's trembling voice had come through my office phone earlier that day. She was one of our longest-standing clients, a widow in her 70s who relied on her investments to get by. I don't understand. I thought I had more money. But it's gone. Almost all of it. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't the type to make mistakes. She kept meticulous records, always calling to double-check every transaction. I'll look into it, Mrs. Whitmore, I promised, trying to steady my voice. After we hung up, I marched into Richard's office. His door was always closed, a signal that he wasn't to be disturbed unless it was important. Well, this was important. I knocked once and walked in before he could answer. What now? He snapped without looking up, his fingers tapping rapidly on his keyboard. It's about Mrs. Whitmore, I began, trying to keep my tone professional. She says a large sum of money is missing from her account. He stopped typing and leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Emily, she's old. Probably just confused. Happens all the time. She's not confused, I countered. I've seen her records. Something's wrong. Richards waved a dismissive hand, as if I were a fly buzzing in his ear. Fine. Run an audit if you're so concerned. But don't waste too much time on it. We've got bigger clients to worry about. Bigger clients. Of course. To Richards, Mrs. Whitmore was just a small fish, someone who didn't bring in enough money to matter. But to me, she was more than a number on a spreadsheet. She was someone who trusted us, someone who deserved better. I left his office seething. That's what led me to stay late that night, combing through account after account, determined to find out what had happened. And eventually, I found it. At first, it was just a hunch, a pattern in the transactions that didn't make sense. Small amounts of money being transferred out of client accounts, always to the same destination, a numbered account with no identifiable owner. The amounts weren't huge, but they added up over time. And when I dug deeper, I discovered the truth. The account belonged to Richards. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. He was stealing from our clients, funneling their money into his own private account. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't the only victim, there were dozens, maybe hundreds. And he'd been doing it for years. I pushed back from my desk, my hands shaking. I wanted to march back into his office and confront him, to demand answers, to scream at him for betraying people who trusted him. But what would that accomplish? Richards was too smart to admit anything, and if I wasn't careful, he'd find a way to pin it all on me. No, I couldn't let him know what I'd found. Not yet. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do. The next day, I called in sick. I spent the morning pacing around my apartment, replaying everything in my head. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough to bring him down, not by itself. Richards was a master manipulator, a man who could spin any situation to his advantage. If I wanted justice, I'd have to play the game on his level. That's when the idea hit me. I sat down at my kitchen table, a pen in one hand and a notebook in the other. Step by step, I started to outline a plan, a way to expose Richards and make sure he couldn't worm his way out of it. It would take time, and it would be risky. But if it worked, it would destroy him. The first thing I needed was evidence, real, undeniable proof that Richards was behind the thefts. I couldn't just rely on the records I'd found. They could be dismissed as errors or misinterpretations. I needed something stronger. I decided to start by watching him. Richards wasn't careful enough to hide his tracks completely, and I was determined to find out how he operated. Over the next few weeks, I paid close attention to everything he did, every phone call he made, every file he touched. I stayed late whenever he did, pretending to be buried in work while secretly keeping an eye on him. It didn't take long to notice the patterns. Richards always made his moves after hours, when the office was empty. He'd close his door, lock it, and stay late into the night, tapping away on his computer. And every time, the next day, another small sum would disappear from a client's account. I started documenting everything. Every suspicious transaction, every late-night session in his office, I kept a detailed record, complete with timestamps and screenshots. But I knew even that might not be enough. Richards was slippery, and if he suspected I was onto him, he'd cover his tracks in an instant. That's when I realized I needed an ally. Someone who could help me from the inside, someone Richards trusted but who might have their own reasons to turn against him. And I knew exactly who to approach. Stacy had been Richards' assistant for 3 years, and she hated him almost as much as I did. She never said it outright, but you could see it in the way her jaw tightened every time he barked an order at her, or the way her hands trembled when she handed him his coffee. Richards treated her like a servant, and I knew she'd jump at the chance to take him down. It wasn't easy, convincing her to trust me. At first, she was hesitant, afraid of what might happen if Richards found out. But when I showed her the evidence I'd gathered, her fear turned to anger. "He's been doing this the whole time," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded. "And he's not going to stop unless we stop him." Stacy agreed to help, but we both knew the risks. Richards wasn't just our boss, he was a man who thrived on control, who would do whatever it took to protect himself. If we were caught, he'd ruin us. But as I looked at Stacy, her eyes blazing with determination, I knew one thing for sure: we weren't going to let him get away with it. If there's one thing I learned about taking down someone as ruthless as Richards, it's that you can't rush it. People like him have spent their lives building walls around themselves, walls of money, power, and influence. Knocking them down takes patience. Every step has to be calculated, every move deliberate. With Stacy on board, we started working in secret. Our goal was simple: to gather enough evidence to ensure Richards couldn't talk his way out of this. But that meant digging deeper into his operation, understanding how he moved the stolen money, and finding something so incriminating that even his high-priced lawyers couldn't spin it. Stacy was the key. As his assistant, she had access to files, emails, and private conversations that no one else in the office ever saw. Over the next few weeks, she fed me bits and pieces of information, small details that, on their own, didn't seem like much, but together painted a picture of just how deep his schemes ran. "Look at this," she whispered one morning, sliding a folder across my desk. Inside were copies of contracts Richards had signed with several clients. At first glance, they seemed normal, basic agreements about managing their investments. But as I read closer, I saw the subtle differences. Hidden clauses gave Richards more control over their accounts than they realized, allowing him to authorize transactions without their explicit approval. "This is how he's doing it," I said, my voice low. Stacy nodded. "He's been using these clauses to make it look like the clients agreed to the transfers. By the time they realize their money's missing, it's too late to do anything about it." I clenched my fists, anger bubbling just below the surface. Richards wasn't just stealing, he was manipulating people into signing away their savings without even knowing it. But knowing how he did it wasn't enough. We needed to catch him in the act. One night, Stacy texted me, "He's staying late tonight. Something big's happening." I'd been waiting for this. For weeks, we'd been piecing together Richard's activities, tracking every suspicious transaction. But we still didn't have the smoking gun we needed to take him down. This could be our chance. I told Stacy to keep him distracted while I made my move. Richard's office was locked, but I'd already figured out how to bypass the electronic lock with a trick I'd learned from a tech-savvy friend. As soon as Richards stepped out for a coffee break, Stacy texted me, and I slipped into his office. The first thing I noticed was his laptop. It sat open on his desk, the screen glowing with an active session. I knew I didn't have much time. I plugged in a USB drive loaded with software designed to copy his files quickly and discreetly. While it worked, I scanned the desk for anything else useful. That's when I saw it, a notebook tucked under a stack of papers. It was filled with handwritten notes, transaction amounts, account numbers, dates. My heart raced as I flipped through the pages. This was it. Proof of everything he'd been doing, laid out in his own handwriting. The USB drive beeped softly, signaling it was done. I grabbed it and the notebook, then slipped out of the office just as Richards returned. My hands were shaking as I sat back at my desk, trying to act normal. Stacy texted me a single word, "Safe." The next day, I combed through the files I'd copied. They were a goldmine, emails to shady offshore bankers, spreadsheets tracking stolen funds, even messages to his partners hinting at more illegal schemes. Richards hadn't just been stealing from clients, he was laundering the money through shell companies and hiding it in accounts across the globe. But one file stood out. It was a transaction scheduled for the following week, transferring $1.2 million from a group of clients into his shadow account. This was the break we needed. If we could intercept the transaction, we'd have undeniable proof of his crimes. But we couldn't just take this to the authorities, not yet. Richards had connections everywhere. If he caught wind of what we were doing, he'd find a way to bury the evidence and come after us. That's when I realized we had to take things one step further. We needed to trap him. The idea came to me late one night as I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. What if we didn't just expose Richards? What if we made him think he was being betrayed by the very people he trusted most, his business partners? Richards' partners were as greedy and corrupt as he was, but they had one crucial weakness: they didn't trust each other. Richards had spent years manipulating them, always staying one step ahead of their paranoia. If we could exploit that paranoia, we could turn them against him. The next day, I explained my plan to Stacy. "We create a fake email chain," I said, "something that makes it look like Richards is stealing from his partners, too. If they think he's been double-crossing them, they'll go after him themselves." Stacy's eyes widened. "You really think that'll work?" I nodded. "People like them always assume the worst of each other. All we have to do is plant the seed." Over the next week, we worked on the fake emails. Using the files we'd copied from Richard's laptop, we crafted a convincing story: secret transactions, coded messages, and veiled threats from Richards to his partners. The emails made it look like Richards had been siphoning money from their joint ventures into his private account. Stacy managed to get into Richard's email while he was out of the office, and we inserted the fake emails into his sent folder. Then we anonymously forwarded them to his partners, making it look like one of them had discovered the betrayal. The trap was set. By the end of the week, chaos erupted. Richard's partners stormed into the office, demanding answers. Their shouting echoed through the building, and even from my desk, I could hear the venom in their voices. "What the hell is this, Richards?" one of them bellowed, slamming a printout of the emails onto his desk. "I don't know what you're talking about," Richard said, his voice strained. "Don't play dumb," another snarled. "You've been stealing from us." For the first time since I'd known him, Richards looked genuinely panicked. He tried to deny it, to smooth things over, but the damage was done. His partners didn't believe him, and worse, they started digging into his finances themselves. That's when they found the same evidence we had: the shadow account, the stolen money, the offshore transfers. And they didn't stop there. They reported him to the authorities, hoping to save their own skins. Richards was backed into a corner, and he knew it. But as satisfying as it was to see him squirm, Stacy and I weren't done yet. We still had the $1.2 million transfer scheduled for the following week, and we had plans for it. The firestorm Richard's partners unleashed was only the beginning. While they tore into him, accusing him of betrayal, Stacy and I worked quietly behind the scenes, preparing for the final blow. The $1.2 million transfer scheduled for the following week wasn't just a payday for Richards, it was the key to bringing him down. We knew that if the money reached his shadow account, Richards would try to disappear it, making it nearly impossible to trace. But what if the money didn't end up where he expected? What if, instead, it landed in the hands of someone who truly deserved it? The idea had been simmering in the back of my mind ever since Mrs. Whitmore's tearful phone call. She had been Richard's victim, just like so many others, and I couldn't shake the image of her voice trembling as she told me how helpless she felt. Stacy agreed, it was poetic justice. Richards had stolen from her, and now we'd make sure she got a piece of it back. But transferring that kind of money was no small feat. Richards had safeguards in place, and even with all the evidence we'd gathered, we couldn't afford to make a mistake. So we came up with a plan, a dangerous, high-stakes plan that would require perfect timing and flawless execution. The first step was to create a fake destination account for the transfer. Stacy worked late that Friday night, pretending to finish reports, while secretly setting up a trust fund in Mrs. Whitmore's name. The trust fund was disguised to look like one of Richard's offshore accounts, complete with fake registration documents and account numbers that matched the format he used. Meanwhile, I prepared the digital tools we'd need to intercept the transaction. I reached out to an old college friend, Marcus, a cybersecurity expert who owed me a favor. When I explained what we were trying to do, he hesitated. "Emily, this is dangerous," he said. "If you get caught messing with that kind of money, you could go to prison." "I know," I replied, my voice steady. "But this isn't just about the money. It's about justice. Are you in or not?" Marcus sighed but agreed to help. He set up a secure system that would reroute the transfer to the trust fund without leaving a trace. It wasn't foolproof, nothing ever is, but it was the best chance we had. The night before the transfer, Stacy and I stayed late at the office, nerves buzzing like live wires. Richards was still reeling from the fallout with his partners, but he hadn't cancelled the transaction. In fact, he seemed more desperate than ever, barking orders and slamming doors as he scrambled to regain control. "This is it," I whispered to Stacy as we sat at our desks, waiting for the office to empty. She nodded, her face pale but determined. "If this doesn't work." "It will," I said, more to reassure myself than her. By midnight, the building was silent. Richards had left hours ago, unaware of what we were about to do. Stacy watched the security cameras while I logged into the system, using Richard's credentials to access the transaction. My hands trembled as I typed, but I forced myself to stay calm. Step by step, we rerouted the transfer to the trust fund. Marcus' program worked flawlessly, masking the change so it looked like the money was still heading to Richard's shadow account. By the time we were done, my palms were slick with sweat, but the transfer was ready. "Now we wait," I said, leaning back in my chair. The next morning, the chaos began. At exactly 9 a.m., the $1.2 million transfer went through, but instead of landing in Richard's account, it disappeared into the trust fund. Stacy and I watched from our desks as Richards stormed into the office, his face red with rage. "Where's my money?" he shouted, slamming his laptop onto his desk. His outburst drew the attention of everyone in the office. Employees exchanged nervous glances, whispering behind their hands as Richards frantically called his banker. "What do you mean it's gone?" he yelled into the phone. "That's impossible. Check again." Stacy and I shared a look, barely able to hide our satisfaction. For the next hour, Richards tore through his office like a madman, calling everyone he could think of to track down the missing money. But no matter how many calls he made, the answer was always the same: the account didn't exist. Finally, he turned to Stacy. "Get IT on the phone," he barked. "I want to know if anyone tampered with the system." Stacy nodded, her face blank, and pretended to make the call. In reality, she was stalling, giving us time to execute the next phase of the plan. While Richards was distracted, I slipped out of the office and made a call of my own, to the IRS. Using a burner phone, I provided them with the evidence we'd collected, including the details of the $1.2 million transfer. I made it clear that this wasn't just a one-time theft. Richards had been running this scheme for years, and his clients deserved justice. The agent on the other end of the line sounded skeptical at first, but as I explained the depth of Richards' crimes, I could hear the shift in their tone. By the time I hung up, they had everything they needed to launch a full-scale investigation. But we weren't done yet. The final step was to notify Mrs. Whitmore. That afternoon, I called her from my personal phone. "Mrs. Whitmore, it's Emily," I said, my voice soft. "I have some good news." "Oh, Emily," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again. What is it? Do you remember the money that went missing from your account?" "Yes," she said hesitantly. "Well, it's been recovered," I told her. "In fact, it's already been placed in a trust fund in your name. You'll have full access to it starting today." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Emily, is this a joke?" she whispered. "It's not a joke," I said, smiling through the tears welling in my eyes. "It's real. And it's yours." Mrs. Whitmore started to cry, soft, happy sobs that made everything we'd done feel worth it. "Thank you," she said over and over. "Thank you so much." I hung up the phone, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. By the end of the day, the office was in chaos. Richards had locked himself in his office, refusing to talk to anyone, while whispers of his missing money spread like wildfire. But the real fireworks came the next morning, when federal agents arrived at the office. Richards tried to act calm, but his face betrayed him. As the agents escorted him out in handcuffs, the entire office gathered to watch. Some people whispered in shock, others just stared. I stayed silent, my expression neutral, but inside, I felt a rush of vindication. This wasn't just about the $1.2 million. It was about all the people Richards had hurt, all the lives he'd ruined. And now, he was finally facing the consequences. But I knew this wasn't the end. Richards wasn't the type to go down without a fight. And if he figured out who was behind his downfall, Stacy and I might not be safe for long. Richards' arrest was supposed to be the end of it. As the federal agents hauled him out of the office, his face pale and drenched in sweat, I thought the nightmare was over. Stacy and I had done what we set out to do. Justice had been served, Mrs. Whitmore was finally made whole, and Richards was facing a long list of charges that would all but guarantee he'd rot in prison for the rest of his life. But I was wrong. 3 days after his arrest, I got a text message. It was short, just 3 words, but it made my blood run cold. "We need to talk." The message was from Richards. My stomach flipped as I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it was a mistake. Maybe someone else had his phone. Maybe this was a prank. But the number was his, and I knew better. Richards wasn't the type to let things go. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind spun with questions. How did he get my number? What did he know? Most importantly, what did he want? By morning, I decided to ignore it. Richards was finished. He could text me all he wanted, but he had no power now. I tried to convince myself that whatever he was planning wouldn't matter. But the texts kept coming. "You think you're smart. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know what you did." Each one sent a chill down my spine. I deleted them as soon as they came in, hoping to erase the growing fear in the pit of my stomach. I didn't respond. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. Then, 2 days later, the emails started. They weren't from Richard's personal email address but from an anonymous one, no name, no signature, just cryptic messages that hinted at something darker. "I have everything. Check your office." That last one made me stop cold. My office? What did he mean? I arrived at work early the next morning, my heart pounding as I unlocked the door. The office was empty, silent except for the faint hum of computers coming to life. I walked slowly to my desk, scanning the room for anything out of place. When I reached my desk, I saw it, a plain white envelope sitting on my keyboard. My hands shook as I picked it up, tearing it open. Inside was a single piece of paper. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Below the note was a photo of me and Stacy in Richard's office the night we rerouted the transfer. The angle was grainy, likely from a hidden security camera we hadn't seen. I felt the blood drain from my face. He knew. For the next few hours, I kept my head down, pretending to work while my thoughts raced. Stacy hadn't arrived yet, and I wasn't sure if I should tell her. If Richards had this, what else did he have? By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I called her. "Stacy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have a problem." She met me at a nearby coffee shop, her face pale and drawn as I slid the photo across the table. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. How does he have this?" "I don't know," I said. "But if he has this, he could have more. Emails, files, everything we did." Stacy's eyes darted around the cafe, her paranoia matching my own. "Do you think he's going to use it?" "To?" "I don't know, blackmail us." "He's already using it," I said, my voice tight. "The texts, the emails. He's not done." We sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. 2 days later, the first bombshell dropped. It was all over the news: disgraced CEO accuses employees of financial sabotage. I stared at the screen in disbelief as a slick PR attorney spoke on Richard's behalf, spinning a story that turned the truth on its head. According to the attorney, Richards had been framed. Stacy and I were the real masterminds, using our positions at the company to falsify evidence and redirect stolen funds into offshore accounts. My phone buzzed non-stop as friends and coworkers texted, asking if it was true. My parents called, their voices trembling as they begged me to explain. But the worst part wasn't the calls or the headlines. The worst part was the video. Later that day, a surveillance clip leaked to the media. It showed Stacy and me sneaking into Richard's office, rummaging through his desk, and accessing his computer. The footage had no audio, no context, but it didn't matter. To anyone watching, it looked exactly like what Richards claimed it was: 2 rogue employees caught red-handed. The fallout was immediate. Stacy and I were both fired. Our former co-workers avoided us like the plague, whispering behind our backs as we packed up our desks. Worse, we were summoned for questioning by the authorities. When we arrived at the federal building, our stomachs in knots, we were escorted into a room where 2 agents sat waiting, their expressions cold and unyielding. "You've been named as persons of interest in a federal investigation," one of them said. "What investigation?" I asked, my voice shaking. The agent slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of bank statements, emails, and transaction records, only they weren't the ones we'd uncovered from Richards. These were fabricated, doctored to make it look like Stacy and I had been stealing money from the company for years. My mind reeled as I flipped through the pages. Richards had set us up, carefully planting false evidence to shift the blame. And the worst part? It was convincing. For weeks, Stacy and I lived in a nightmare. Lawyers drained our savings as they tried to clear our names, but Richard's connections ran deep. Every piece of evidence we presented was dismissed, every argument we made twisted against us. The media painted us as villains. Headlines like "Office Rats Steal Millions" and "Trusted Employees Betray CEO" splashed across every outlet. My name, my face, everything I'd worked for, was dragged through the mud. But the worst blow came 1 month later, when the charges against Richards were quietly dropped. The IRS investigation ended abruptly, with no explanation. Rumor had it that Richards had struck a deal, offering up Stacy and me as scapegoats in exchange for his freedom. And just like that, he was free, while we were left to pick up the pieces of our shattered lives. One night, as I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the eviction notice on my kitchen table, I got another text. "You should have stayed in your lane." It was followed by a photo of Richards, sitting on the deck of a yacht, a glass of champagne in his hand. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, anger bubbling up inside me. For weeks, I'd been hiding, terrified of what he might do next. But now, something inside me snapped. If Richards thought this was over, he was wrong. Because I wasn't done yet.